If the Brazilian public does not quickly acquire the basic knowledge that enables it to recognize at least elementary disinformation operations, our entire press, our entire political class, and even officers of the armed forces may become, in the very short term, defenseless and foolish disinforming agents at the service of the communist revolution in Latin America. Most of our literate classes do not even know what disinformation is. They imagine it is merely false information for general propaganda purposes. They completely ignore that it consists of actions perfectly calculated with a purpose, and that in 90% of cases this purpose is not to influence the masses, but to reach very specific targets, rulers, great businessmen, military commands, to induce them to strategic decisions harmful to their own interests and those of their country. Propaganda disinformation deals only with political data within the reach of the people. High-level disinformation falsifies specialized and technical information of incomparably greater relevance. The use of falsified information has been known in military arts since the world began. The art of war consists substantially of deception, said Sun Tzu in the 5th century BC. Examples of false information used outside the strict military field appear here and there in world history. Slanders against Jews and Protestants in Catholic countries, against Catholics and Jews in Protestant countries, were often premeditated to justify persecutions. The revolutionaries of 1789 set up a true industry of false information to turn public opinion against the king and, later, to induce it to support the tyrannical measures of the revolutionary government. The most famous example was the Great Fear, alarmist information spread by the government, which, announcing the imminent return of the royal troops, impossible at that point, triggered explosions of popular violence against suspected monarchists, explosions which the government itself then ordered the police to control, shining at the end with the aura of peacemaker. The history of revolutions is the history of lies. But all this was not yet disinformation. Lenin's personal invention, disinformation, disinformatia, consists of systematically extending the use of the military technique of falsified information to the more general field of political, cultural, educational strategy, etc. That is, making deception, which was the basis of the art of war alone, the foundation of all governmental action, and therefore, an instrument of social and political engineering. This transformed the entire human coexistence into a war, a total and permanent war. When Hitler first used, in 1939, the expression total war to designate a modern type of war that involved not only politicians and military, but the whole society, the reality of the thing had already existed since 1917 in Russia, even without fighting an external enemy. Socialism is total and permanent civil war. In Lenin's government, disinformation was also the general rule of foreign policy. The famous economic opening, planned as a dialectical stage of an imminent total nationalization, was announced as a sign of a promising softening of revolutionary rigor, not only to attract capitalists, but to dissuade Western governments from supporting any counter-revolutionary effort. Thus, many exiled leaders, abandoned by the countries that sheltered them and deceived by the false promise of democratization in Russia, returned to the homeland as calculated and, obviously, were executed on the spot. Of those who did not return, many were killed in exile by agents of the Cheka, the future KGB. The use of deceitful information on this scale was an absolute novelty in world politics. To get an idea of how unprepared Western powers were for this, it suffices to know that the U.S. did not have a regular secret service to operate abroad in peacetime until on the eve of World War II. Another point of comparison, the Soviet cultural offensive, seduction and purchase of consciences in the high intellectual spheres and show business, began already in the 1920s. The CIA did not react with a similar initiative until the 1950s, and was immediately blocked by the general media outcry against anti-communist hysteria. Despite the abject defenselessness of Western powers before the Russian Revolution, Lenin's government kept the people on edge, trumpeting that thousands of foreign secret agents were on Russian soil plotting counter-revolution. One of the rare agents who were proven to be there was the Englishman Sidney Riley, a mythomaniac informant whom the Foreign Office considered very unreliable, and whom Soviet propaganda made the supreme mentor of the imminent foreign invasion that, evidently, never happened. To assess the reach of Soviet disinformation effects, it suffices to note that until the 1970s, the book by Michael Sayers and Albert E. Kahn, The Great Conspiracy, inspired by Leninist alarmism of 1917, still circulated in Brazilian translation as a serious work, endorsed by a major publisher. Faced with such cases of residual spontaneous self-disinformation, it is no surprise that the Soviets held Brazilian intelligence, especially communist intelligence, in very low regard. Large-scale disinformation operations are only possible for a totalitarian regime, with state control of the means of dissemination, or for an underground party with power of life and death over its militants. Any similar attempt in a democratic environment runs up against press and legislative oversight. There is, therefore, no Western equivalent of Soviet disinformation. A government can, of course, engage in deceptive propaganda, but it cannot conduct disinformation because it lacks the means for calculated control of the effects, which is precisely what distinguishes Leninist technique. Conversely and complementarily, freedom of information in democratic countries has always been of formidable utility for Soviet disinformation, not only because of the continuous leaking of secret government information to the press, but also because of the ease of spreading false information through a media eager for denunciations and scandals. The famous Armenian general Ivan I, Agayants, for many decades chief of the KGB's disinformation department, was often astonished at the ease of planting lies in the American press. Astonished and grateful, he said, "If the Americans did not have freedom of the press, I would invent it for them." Note, this subject continues in next week's article. For now, feel free to conjecture the following. How many disinformation technicians, who learned in Cuba under KGB guidance, are today opinion makers in Brazil?